Hello, I'm Ben. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to have a topic that's a little bit different than normal. It actually is still wisdom based, right? It's 20 books to survive the apocalypse or the end of the world, right? So the truth is, every single day is the end of the world for someone. If you think about all the countries that have come and gone before us, and all of the great empires that have come and gone before us, there was some point during that empire that they thought it would go on forever. Look at Rome, look at old England, look at France and what it was in the historical past. No one sees the end. If you think about the Aztec and the Inca, or the earlier colonies on this continent, where we had one, the Croatoan, that just disappeared from a colony in Virginia that just disappeared, and no one knows what happened to them. The idea is, what could sustain you, or what would sustain you, or what would you do for wisdom should something like that, something remarkable happen? And obviously, for something like that to happen in America, that would mean that it would be a global picture, right? Not to walk too far down a rabbit hole, but you can look at survivalists and preppers and all of that on the internet. What I'm talking about is just the wisdom that you'd want to carry beyond should life take a change. And there's no internet, there's no YouTube. What would you do to sustain your own knowledge, to grow your knowledge, and sustain the knowledge of future generations should you survive whatever is going on? So that's kind of my thought process into making this video, and it's pretty entertaining. It took some entertaining turns in my head on what would be necessary and what should I pick. So we'll start with Proverbs 29:18, where it says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he." So basically, what we're talking about, that vision, is wisdom. Okay, so if and here's a different way to look at that, if that's a little too extreme of an angle. If you don't have a library in your home, my question to you would be why. If you don't own books, my question would be to you, why? I was speaking to a young lady a few weeks ago, and she said that she doesn't read anything in a book anymore, that she just uses her tablet. Well, what happens to all those books on that tablet if she doesn't have power and can't charge the batteries, right? So let's talk about a in the world type situation where what we have goes away. You're going to lose battery power in the first week, right? First 2 weeks. People will be scrambling for water and food and all those things. And then books, depending on where people live, you've seen it portrayed in movies where they're burned for warmth as fire and then used as toilet paper and everything else. So this video is to suggest, roughly, just for entertainment purposes and also for the wisdom that's within them. I truly do think that everyone should have a library that contains what I'm about to recommend here, especially if you live in the United States, okay? Now, if you're elsewhere in the world, that's fine too. These books would serve you just as well. And there's some in here saying around our American history and folklore. Maybe you would pick something in your area, like European or South American or wherever it is that you are. So these things are my suggestions for that. So we'll go ahead and start out. So book number 1 out of 20 books. The first one, obvious to me, is the Constitution. So this is the writings, it's the Constitution of the United States and selected writings of the Founding Fathers. So this book itself contains quite a bit. It's got writings from John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and George Washington. And this is a historical piece, which is extremely important, right? If you're thinking that things are going away, so you can't study history and you can't study where we come from, the only way to regain what you once had is to look at it and try to do the same things again, replicate the successes that you had to get back there. So that would be number 1. The Constitution of the United States is definitely what I think the best rule of law is in the world. And if we actually legislated to it appropriately in America, America would be a much better place than it is these days as well, with the idea of being liberty and freedom for all. And I think that would be great as a universal law. And that would be book number 1. That's where I would start, the Constitution of the United States of America. The next one that's in line with that is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So anyone that's ever read this book, especially live in the States, you should read that book. It goes back and it talks about him and what he did and when he decided he'd put his life on the line to help create this country. this great nation that we live in, and his thoughts as he was doing it. So kind of takes you from when he was poor and abandoned and how he got to build himself as a man of stature and move on through his life where he became one of the great forefathers of this nation and had played a very key part with extreme courage to be in a spot where his life was very much on the line, to move forward with writings and post things and publish things that would put him in harm's way with the crown and the king, right? So that was kind of one of the strongest things I got from the book. And also in the book, it talks about his favorite book, Pilgrim's Progress, which if you're talking about settlement and you're talking about how you change your life and grow in an area, that's a great book to read as well. But that's not what I'm recommending today. So there's my book number 2, the autobiography. I don't know why I can't say that word today, of Benjamin Franklin. Then number 3 is my favorite book. We've talked about it before, right? The King James Version of the Holy Bible, for several different reasons. One, for the wisdom that comes from the Bible itself, but 2, for the words and for the deep description and the history that's within the Bible. If you imagine that you're training and you're teaching future generations, right? You don't have the internet, there's nothing else except for what you have in your hands. There is no greater offering of wisdom and history than what the Bible gives in the modern world. I can't think of one. If you can, please put it in the comments below, and I'll happily buy a copy and study that as well. So the Holy Bible, King James Version, would be the next book there. And these aren't in any specific order. Obviously, I picked up the Bible first, but I kind of stacked them up here so I could get through them all. So that's just how the stack worked. One's not higher on the list than the other. The Bible was the first book I picked, though. But second to that, the next thing would be a Strong's Concordance. And this exhaustive concordance is actually going to serve you in many ways, not only as a guide through the Bible and where the Bible came from in the historic text and give you the translations of all those different texts, but it has multiple languages within it that it does address and it does talk about. Also, you think about definitions and things of that nature. You're not going to be able to search words elsewhere, right? And if you're living in a world where books will be of value again because knowledge is in books, and you'll be trying to collect those books, you want to make sure you understand what's in them. So the Strong's Concordance, even though it is discussing the Bible, it will also give definitions of words and use them in sentences and paragraphs so you can understand what those words mean and how they work in a paragraph. These books are going to jump around a little bit. So the next thing I would choose is a survival book, or this one. This is a great one. This is the Outdoorsman's Manual. It's put out by Field and Stream a few years ago, and it is excellent. Cover to cover, it tells you how to do everything that you could imagine, from tracking animals to tracking people to hunting to fishing to harvesting wild vegetables and fruits to survive. It's got all of that stuff in it. The reason you need to think about that is if we're in a situation where transportation goes down and food and things can't get around the country as they would, then you're going to have to survive on what's local to you. For those that live in cities, it's going to be a real tough time if something like that were to happen. And the suggestion would be that you get out of those cities, you move away as quickly as possible, and you try to find fresh water and foods and options to sustain yourself. One of those survival books of some type, that's my recommended one just because of the amount that it covers. And it's very brief in the description, so it actually gives pretty good definition on what to do and how to do things. And that's the Field and Stream Total Outdoorsman Manual. I am an outdoorsman, so that's an entertaining read to me, but it serves a very distinct purpose. And for people who have never done any of that, if you've never hunted your own food or grown your own food or harvested your own food when gathered it in a wild setting, if you've never done any of those things, to have to do that at some point to sustain, that really is going to limit a lot of people's ability to survive. You know, water's number one. We don't think about it. If you don't have water for 3 days, and honestly, I'll say a day and a half, especially if you're a larger person, after a day and a half, if you're dehydrated, your head's going to be splitting in two. You're not going to be functional to be able to do much. So if you don't know how to get water and do it in a quick manner, in a way that it's safe to drink, that could change the situation you're in. I got amoebic dysentery once in South America, and I didn't think I was going to make it, you know, for drinking water down there. I made an accident and had an accident, drank a little bit of water down there that I did not boil or that was not bottled. And I paid for it. It was the sickest I've ever been. So just something to think about. Look at some of that, and it'll give you some guides on how to do things that maybe you don't know how to do or you weren't raised to do them like I was. Here's the next offering: Basic Butchering of Livestock and Game. So once you have an animal that you've caught, captured, killed for food, you need to know how to process it too. And of that processing piece, you need to know how to cut it and what's safe to eat, what's not, what you're going to see that will tell you this is no good, don't eat it. Roadkill, for example. Poor people still to this day eat roadkill. People don't know that, but especially during the rut season of deer season and October, here in the next few months, October, November, a lot of animals are hit on the sides of highways. People still pick that stuff up and eat it when it's fairly fresh, right? So this will show you how to butcher that, what's safe to eat, what's not, how to do it in an appropriate manner. The very next thing is, this is one, anything like this would be a good recommendation. This is called Preserving Summer's Bounty. This book talks a little bit about how to preserve food, from meat to vegetables to pickling to canning, how you do all that. A book like this, these are getting harder and harder to find. And you better believe that if something happens and people have to go back to these sciences on how they do that to sustain themselves, people are going to have a pretty difficult time doing that, especially in a world where people are used to eat nothing but carbohydrate and don't know how to process and maintain their own food or how to properly store their own food. Right now, everything comes in very cool packaging. If that didn't happen, what would you do, right? So a book like that is pretty much a requirement in what you need to do, there. So here's the next one, next selection. This is the Encyclopedia of American Gun Design and Performance. I picked this one because within this book, it tells you how to use a number of different weapons. It tells you how they work, how the projectile is slung, and it also has a few recipes here and there for actually coming up with gunpowder and mixing it so it works properly for each of the weapons, and it's not going to be a dangerous charge that will explode the weapon, but actually be usable. Something like that is going to be necessary, because if you're not armed, you don't have a way of arming yourself. That would be one of the first things you would do in that type of stuff hits the fan situation, where you have to, one, know how to operate what it is you have, know how to keep that in battery and how to keep it where it's functional and handling issues downrange. But overall, the understanding, if you don't have it, if you weren't trained in it and you don't know it, having something like that can tell you how to fix something that could save your life. Whereas if you don't do it, it is what it is, right? It goes back to America has more guns than the rest of the world combined, but the majority of folks that own guns own many, whereas some don't own any. I don't know why anybody in a world where you have the right to protect yourself would do one of two things, would give up that right, right? It's in our constitutional rights. I don't know why anybody would have an issue with the Second Amendment. If anyone goes against the Constitution of the United States and doing something directly alternative to it, that is treasonous based on the way the Constitution is written. So people that don't like the Second Amendment, that's fine. You don't have to participate. But in this type of world we're talking about, that's going to put you in a very hard spot, right? So you have to defend yourself, you have to protect yourself, you have to hunt for your food, you have to do all that. It was only 100 years ago, 150 years ago, where people had their own property, where they raised their own food, where they hunted for their own food, where they did all that, and that was the primary expectation in life, right? Now, granted, people lived in cities, and all that food had to be hunted and brought in from outside of the cities to serve those people. And freshness was a big situation, right? There wasn't refrigeration like there is now. I mean, that was fairly recent, the last 130 years. But when you think about that, people had to feed themselves, and also they knew where their food came from. So there's another piece of that. A lot of people right now have never once procured their meal for themselves. Many people on this planet have never once shot, cleaned, and processed food to eat, or planted, tended, grown, harvested food that they intended to eat. They have no idea how to get from dirt to the table. That's going to be an issue in a situation like what we're talking about. So you want to have a library, you want to have books like this that are useful to you and show you how to survive those situations. One of the next options, this is a really good book. This is The Secrets of Chinese Herbalists by Richard Lucas. I read this book, I didn't know really what was going to come out of it, but it has tons of medicinal, tons of seasoning, tons of plant this with that because it'll make it grow better suggestions, and a way to use these things to heal yourself and for specific disorders and sicknesses that these things will address. This is what the natives in this country did. The the greenery, the fauna, or I guess the plants and those things in China and in that section of the world are very similar to the United States, because when Pangea broke apart, the United States and China were side by side. And so a lot of the plants and the life that we have are very similar, right? So that actually serves as a very good reference for what we grow here and what happens here, just like it is there. So it's a very good book. The next one I recommend is There's Not Going to Be People to Do Things For You. So this Complete Woodworker book is a very useful tool. It tells you a couple of things. One of which, how to set jigs and build your own tools so you can process wood appropriately, how to build the tools that you need to build the jig, and how to do those things. Because that's something that if things aren't going to be available, everything's not going to be made out of plastic and all these things that we have that are quickly produced today, if this is the situation, right? So a book like that will teach you how to be more useful to yourself, how to protect yourself better, and how to make barriers and walls between you and the outside world. Remember, the first doors and locks and all that were made out of trees, boards that were cut out of trees, right? So if you don't know how to process a tree into boards, that's one suggestion that could cause you a problem, right? Or if you don't know how to build your own tools to do such, that could cause you a problem. So something to think about. That Complete Woodworker is a good book. So as we continue down the path, you'll see those are some of the survival type things that have come to mind for me that every library needs. I'll go ahead and finish that with these two. I had a copy of this book when I was a kid, A Veterinary Guide to Animal Owners, or for Animal Owners. That book disappeared as I went off to college, and it was one of my favorite books, and I had pages marked and had things marked in it. So I hated to see that copy go. But when it did, as soon as I realized I wasn't going to get that back, I went and bought another copy. The reason being, animal husbandry is something that a lot of folks still do in the South. And a lot of folks across the country here in the States have chickens and ducks and those type things, so they still have some of that going on. But, with the pandemic a few years ago, I saw an uptick in people that were interested in having chickens and having garden spots or raised gardens in their yards, because it got a little difficult to buy things at the time. We saw egg prices go up to $8 a dozen, when they used to be cents. And folks that relied on that for food, they saw very quickly how quickly that food can be taken away. Of course, all the toilet paper disappeared as well, and that was kind of a stupid situation. But if you don't, that's another thing, if you don't have a library and toilet paper goes away, you don't have the bad books to use as necessary, right? So that's one thing that's useful in having many, many books should you get in that situation. But the point is, people took on getting chickens and doing that, and I'm on some of the groups and see some of the questions that are asked. You'd be amazed at how far. And see, I take it for granted because I was raised on a farm. We grew plants and animals and for every different purpose for our own food supply, and we sold that food into the food supply that sustained the people around us in the state where I lived. So that's kind of a thought process. That veterinary guide for animal owners, what it does, it shows you how to sustain your animals, the best thing you can feed them, the best way they survive, how you pen them, those type things. And it handles all different types of illnesses up to and including if the animal eats hardware, right, and hardware disease. And it shows you how to fix that in an animal that punctured its stomach. So it's a very good book to have. It gives you those holistic options to take care of the animals that you have. So that'd be worth looking into. The next one from that mindset is this one. This is an Encyclopedia of Country Living. This is the 10th edition. I'll tell you, this is a manual that is chock full of all of those old home remedies that I told you about. And it shows you how to use tools appropriately. It shows you what tools are appropriate. It tells you how to pull stones out of ground and what do you do if you have this issue or that issue. So that's a great, great reference, and it ties into a lot of the other references that I've already suggested to help you get through that process. So, if you are interested in starting a library, you don't have one, and you're interested in starting one, my suggestion is you start with these 20 books. I think if you start here, you'll be in real good shape. If you don't get all of them, or if you, from a locality standpoint, something else makes more sense, then go for it. But I would start with this as the mark to begin with. So the next thing is, remember, if there's no electricity, the only thing you're going to have to entertain yourself outside of all your jobs and tasks, right? So that's one of the things. Sustaining clean water, sustaining food, keeping a fire, those things are all going to be daily, all day long type responsibilities that you can't ignore. Keeping a fire, for instance, it may be what keeps your water clean so you can drink it. If you let the fire go out and you don't know how to start a fire, now you're in trouble. If you don't have a start a fire at all, reference 2 of those books that I've already suggested. Because if you can't start a fire with your bare hands, you've got some risk there that you need to consider if we're talking about this end of the world type situation, right? But with there not being a lot of other things to do, if you do have downtime and you've got everything going and you've got the week pretty well covered, the next thing you get into is entertainment. And so I've got some suggestions around that. So the first one would be this American Treasury of American Poetry. So this was started to be printed back in the 50s. This version has been updated since 1975. And the last update, I think, came out in 2006 or 2007. They update it every 10 to 15 years. So that American poetry, just from a standpoint of intellect, it will help you use the vocabulary. And that's one thing that's very true. Today, we have less of a vocabulary than we've ever had before. I think in Benjamin Franklin's time, they said people knew 300,000 to 400,000 words that they used with regularity. And now I think the estimate is 40,000 or less that we use. And half of them we abbreviate and we use letters most of the time. So as a populace, globally, we are getting dumber because we have less understanding of words that used to be there in the past. So if you don't have a knowledge of these words and you find a book that would be useful and you're trying to read through it, you may not know what it means. So with that being said, studying poetry will bring up those words. And then something like this. This is a Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary. So this has Old Testament and New Testament words. And if you think about our modern English, it was based on the English that the Old and New Testament were written. And it comes from the Greek and it comes from the Hebrew, right? Latin is in that too. So something like that will give you a better utilization of the words that you're going to have already in these texts that we have. So that knowledge that comes from that, you will have a more granulated and fuller understanding of the knowledge that's in those books by having that book. So just a suggestion, if you're going to have a library, these are the 20 books that I'd recommend to get you going and keep you going. So the next one is no surprise. This book actually, it includes a couple different things. So when you're building your library, maybe look for a copy of this version versus just getting a singular book. So then you own less books, but you have more in them. In this book, you have the Apology of Socrates, which is extremely important. It's one of the greatest things that was ever written, and is very highly studied. You have Credo, which is Crito, and you have the Phaedo, which is Phaedo, all by Plato, right? So all 3 of those are by Plato. That's spelled Plato. Not Playdo, right? Plato. And then you have the Golden Sayings of Epictetus, and you have the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which you guys already know that's one of my favorite books. So this one has all 3 or all 4 of those angles in it, so you can read that and have that. And those are great wisdom from 3 different civilizations that came before us, or different eras of a situation around civilization that came before us. And that was carried and studied around the world. So it's definitely worth sustaining that should we be in that situation. The next one I would recommend, and this goes back to the survival mindset. If you don't have a weapon, you can't do it with your own 2 hands, then you need to know how to build traps. So this is Firearms, Traps, and Tools of the Mountain Men. This was used here in our country. This technology was used here in our country heavily in the last 3 centuries. And that technology will still work today. We still use some here on our place to catch what's necessary, to catch predators that would attack our animals, or to catch game that's out there. There's a lot in that book that if you don't want to use a firearm or don't think you can, or if there's a natural forest or somewhere where you can't have a firearm, that would change, I guess, in this situation that we're talking about. But using those techniques, and it shows you how to use those tools. It shows you how to build those tools. So that's a very important book to add to your 20-book library to prep you for the end of the world if that's the case. So that's another great book with a vast amount of knowledge. And not only does it tell you what the tools look like and has a picture of those, it tells you how to use them, how to implement them, and how it works. And it shows pictures of those things in there. Great old book, extremely useful in what we're talking about here. And one more in that vein. This is we've already looked at one or two outdoors encyclopedias, so obviously I'm leading heavily on those because these are what going to teach you these are the references that will teach you what is edible, what is medicinal, where you find it, for the topography of the region you're in, the topography and the weather, what would work best where you are, and what you should use as a primary food source, secondary food source, or for water sources. So you want to look at those for that. Here is the Complete Outdoors Encyclopedia, and this is by Sperano. This is actually they update this book it looks like every 10 years, but it's got global ideas in here and utilizations that will be supported and sustained in some of these other books that we've already discussed. So that's another great book for reference. So that'd be one of our 20 books to survive the apocalypse. The next one, there's always, this was very big in the 70s and 80s, right? They had tons of different options, and some of them you bought the volumes, and there'd be 54 volumes or something like this. This is a complete book of home improvement, and it's got 3,000 color photographs and over 400 projects. What's cool about that is you can look at it and see how it's done, right? The complete book of home improvements. If you use something like this, and you have this in your library, you can fix things around your house that you may not know that you can fix. That's the thing about do-it-yourself projects. What that does is it builds your confidence in your ability to fix problems that you come across in your home. So that would be a great option and be a great hobby to take up if you don't have any of that confidence just as yet. And if you don't have tools around your house, you need to buy a book like that to see what tools and what supplies it suggests that you have on hand. Most folks in the state that live at least in the South have a garage or have a toolbox that has a sufficient amount of tools and things like that in it. And of course, we go to garage sales and yard sales and all that jazz and buy, buckets, coffee buckets of bolts and nuts and screws and nails. So that's something that's very common here in the States. If it's not common where you live, that's something that maybe you should consider. You should have at least the tools, the hand tools. And remember, if all you have is power tools, you may want to consider having hand tools that do what those power tools do with a different action to put them into batteries. So that's something to think about. That's something to have, because so you have a generator and you have power tools. Well, great. What happens when the fuel runs out? Okay. What happens when the spark plugs are no good? What happens when the hoses wear out? What happens when that breaks down and you don't have redundancy, you don't have spare parts on hand? Ultimately, it's going to come down to doing stuff with your hands. So having hand tools and having ways to use levers and pulleys to reduce the weight of work. So something like that is highly, highly recommended, just so you know what you need to begin with to handle jobs that you don't know how to handle at the moment. And you learn that one step at a time. So that's a great reference. And then there's two more here. One, I picked this one. It's called The Greatest Battles in History. So this is not an American-only book. This actually studies history from all over the world. And what's cool about that is if you're teaching future generations, and these are the only books you have to do so, that's going to teach strategy, military strategy, where it was based on, what phalanx lines looked like, what should be the expectation to work flanks, drive flanks, and circle and in battle. And it's definitely a strong reference on what we've already done in the past. And obviously this is a suggestion. You can get something very similar to that. But from an entertainment purpose and educational purpose, from that standpoint, that is a great reference to learn from our history and from the history around the world on what works properly in warfare. So you got to think too, if stuff has hit the fan, right, and guns and ammo aren't readily available, and you make it through the first 90 days. So in any situation, this is my thought process. In the first 90 days, that's going to take care of a lot of issues, okay? The people that can survive past the first 90 days, which I think would probably be around 30% of the global population should something actually happen, just from water itself is going to be, it's going to be a huge issue for folks. Then you got malaria and you've got these illnesses if it happens during the summertime. If you think about the Katrinas of the world, think about New Orleans and how that looked after that storm. If you don't have the support of a national force to come and help, and still think out with a national force like we had, think about how awful and how long that lasted for the people of New Orleans and Louisiana down there. It was a brutal time. But just think about how different that would be if those support structures weren't in place. So that's kind of what I hold to is what's happened in my lifetime and what I've seen. And I've had conversations with my grandparents when I was a kid, and my great-grandparents around the Great Depression, and how if you didn't grow it, you didn't eat it, right? And the water came out of the ground from a well. A lot of people, the majority of people in the world right now are not rural people, especially in the United States. We've had a turn in the last 15 years where used to be more people lived in rural areas, and now we're more of an urban population. So that can suggest different things, right? Water itself is going to be a huge limiting factor for people. That's why I think these are so important to have and to study. So if you have a library with 20 books, and the last one in the set is this. It's a book about, it's a Treasury of American Folklore. And this one is a version that's updated every, I think, 10 years as well. And I've opened it up here just to tell you, in the table of contents, I'm seeing there's probably over 400 stories in here of historical folklore from the United States. The reason that's important is in those stories, there are educational points in those stories, right? They all serve a purpose to tell you learn something from them. If we're back in this situation, those type stories would have daily reference, daily points that should be probably usable and understandable based on where we're living, if that would be the case again, because this folklore goes all the way back to the start of the country and back to the colonial days of the United States. So a little bit different video for me. It's still a wisdom based video in the fact that these 20 books, I recommend everyone have a library. This is one of those reasons, just because if you were not able to get wisdom from anywhere else, where would you get it? And if your kids could only be educated by what you taught them, what would you teach them? And if future generations of your family could only be taught by what you had, what could you teach them? And then go through the survival piece of how would you hunt, how would you fish, how would you sustain water, fire, shelter, how would you fix the things as they broke, how would you replace the things as they broke. And these books, these references, not only will show you how to do a lot of that, but kind of show you how many people have been doing it before us. So sometimes when you see that there's a history that was successful and flourishing using technologies that's suggested in here, which may be seen as a much simpler technology than what we do now, it's definitely worth the study. So that's our video for today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like it, put something in the comments. Maybe we'll do more videos around something like this in the future. But these are 20 books that I think everyone should own. Everyone should have a library. And if you don't have room for 20 books in your house, throw something away and get these 20 books. Get something similar. Buy them used. You can find used copies of these everywhere. And just do the best you can to have some knowledge in your house that's not stored on an electronic device. That would be my suggestion, because electronic devices, to have any value, they have to have a battery that's operational. And if you don't have power, that goes away very quickly. So that's my suggestion. If you like these subjects like these and videos like this, please like and share. If you know anyone that might enjoy the channel, please let them know about us so they can come and subscribe, and please like and subscribe yourself. I'm Ben. Be good.